Well, welcome everybody. It's nice to see an audience here in person at the Dickey Center. And I know we have some people watching online as well, and this is also being recorded. So as you're listening to our guest today, I'm sure you'll be coming up with excellent questions that will be out there in perpetuity, recorded for posterity. My name is Bill Wolforth. I'm in the government department here at Dartmouth, where I teach international relations. I am also a newly appointed director of Dartmouth's Initiative in Global Security. And I hope everybody in this room and everybody watching online will stay tuned for further announcements and activities from the Dartmouth Initiative in Global Security. And it's my great pleasure that as the very first public event sponsored by the Dartmouth Initiative for Global Security, I get to welcome to Dartmouth Professor Daniel Dresner of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Professor Drezner is a renowned scholar of international relations who holds a PhD in political science from Stanford University and also studied economics there and went on to make a career combining the study of global economics and global politics, making signal contributions to our understanding of such things as economic sanctions, the governance of the global economy, and many, many other crucial issues. Latterly branching out into issues that I think are of importance to everybody here, including the marketplace of ideas in the United States, how ideas get generated and disseminated and perhaps distorted, and how the international relations theories should be thought about. And now he has turned his formidable talents to a subject near and dear to the hearts and minds of Dartmouth international relations scholars, the subject of U.S. grand strategy. So please join me in welcoming Professor Dan Dresner as he talks about U.S. grand strategy. Rest in peace. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm now going to drink some water, which allows me to take off my mask. Also, I am legitimately thirsty, though, so. Okay. Thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you to everyone on the live stream. I come here to praise U.S. grand strategy and then to bury it. So my argument is relatively simple. Generally speaking, there is a belief that countries need grand strategies, particularly great powers need grand strategies. And grand strategies serve a number of purposes. So they're an attempt to marry state capabilities with social purpose. In other words, grand strategies done well tie a state's means to its desired ends. And in other words, it tells you how you are going to essentially convert A into B. Furthermore, grand strategies are intentional acts of intellectual creation. You don't stumble upon a grand strategy. Presumably you articulate it. It might be articulated in no small part from previously nascent actions, but nonetheless, you then interpret those actions to try to tell people what your intentions are and how you will try to follow through on those intentions. Grand strategies are incredibly useful because done well, they provide an important signal, not just to foreign actors, but also to domestic actors. And I say this having worked in the US government for at least a year, where you would actually have to go back and check the national security strategy or similar grand strategy documents if you were trying to draft memos or draft communiques or what have you, because in some ways you knew that was pre-approved language and that was a pre-approved idea, and therefore you would be able to use that to get your own ideas up the system. And in theory, grand strategies should be both clear and enduring. They should be clear because if you're writing an opaque grand strategy, then you've sort of defeated the purpose. The purpose of grand strategy is to signal to others and to signal to your own government, if X happens, we will proceed with Y. Or if you cross this red line, then these actions will be taken. Or this is really important to us, this other thing, not so much. And so therefore, you need to be clear about that. And also for grand strategies to be useful, they have to be enduring. It's all well and good if someone articulates a national security strategy, but if that national security strategy has a half-life of 2 weeks, then it's not really of all that much utility. And trust me when I say the preparation of these documents takes a fair amount of time, months to years. If you then publish it and no one reads it or no one pays attention to it, you have failed. It is not a successful enterprise. And so, in theory, democracies in particular, and there's a literature about the democratic advantage in world politics, but in theory, democracies should have a comparative advantage in terms of articulating grand strategies for two reasons. The first is that democracies are supposed to have a robust marketplace for ideas in terms of foreign policy. In other words, any kind of grand strategy that is articulated by a government is usually vetted by other sources. There's Congress, there are academics, there are think tanks, there is a whole marketplace of ideas, an ideas industry, if you will, that sort of thinks about these things, regurgitates them, in some ways acts as informal peer reviews. And this is particularly true not so much when the strategy is published, but when the strategy is being formulated. And so in theory, a marketplace of ideas weeds out bad ideas and allows good ideas to survive and thrive. Second, grand strategies should, for democracies, you should see an ability to credibly commit. In other words, one of the advantages that democracies are supposed to possess is that in a somewhat balkanized political system, if you get buy-in from multiple institutions within a particular government, both the executive and the legislative branches, or both the ruling party and the opposition party, this means that a grand strategy will endure past a single administration or a single ruler. It is true that leaders like, let's say, Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping will rule for longer than your average American president or British prime minister. But the question is, what happens after they die? And that's why there's a fair amount of uncertainty with respect to grand strategies in theory for authoritarian countries. So if we look at American grand strategies, they're living less and shorter and shorter lives. So the grand strategy of isolationism, splendid isolation, really you can argue worked for the United States for at least a century, and depending upon how you date it, potentially up to 150 years. The Cold War strategy of containment, which is largely seen now as successful, lasted for less than 50 years. And then what some realists would describe as the post-Cold War strategy of primacy lasted less than 25 years. Now, to be fair, grand strategies have to adjust to shifts in the international distribution of power and other sort of systemic changes. But nonetheless, this suggests a shorter half-life for US grand strategies. Which is interesting because this has actually led to a genuine renaissance of grand strategy debates. And this is, I think, all to the good. And it is not just that you're seeing a renaissance of grand strategy debates. I want to stress you're seeing a renaissance of grand strategy debates, including people who don't look like me. So you are seeing a lot of people, coming from less traditional quarters and publishing in outlets that are nonetheless, taken extremely seriously. And you are seeing a genuine, robust exchange. And this, I think, is good. And you're seeing this whether through CNAS or through War on the Rocks, any of these other outlets. Genuinely a robust exchange of ideas in terms of what the appropriate US grand strategy should be for the 21st century. Which gives me no pleasure to report that it doesn't matter. That I think in the end, this debate, while I think is useful for people like you and people like me, does not actually have any necessarily effect anymore on actually what US foreign policy does. And we can see this in the ways in which grand strategy has shifted somewhat from, let's say, Barack Obama to Donald Trump, and also the ways it's then shifted again from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. So my argument, which I don't know why suddenly that T is down there, this is my argument, is three things. First, grand strategy is simply no longer a viable exercise for the United States. And the reason it is no longer a viable exercise, which is not to say whether that is a good or bad thing, that's another debate to have. I'm just saying, regardless of whether you like grand strategy as a concept or think it's overblown, it doesn't matter anymore. And the reason is that shifts in the marketplace of ideas have rendered grand strategy debates less significant and more superfluous. This is mostly because of two trends that I will talk about in a little more depth later. And also, the growth of presidential power has essentially rendered grand strategy less enduring, which is it used to be that if an administration articulated a grand strategy, in some ways it was like a relay race. The baton would be passed from one US administration to the next. There might be slight tweaks, but there wasn't that much. As we've seen in recent years, it now turns out that the president exerts more and more authority when it comes to foreign policy. And because of underlying shifts in American politics, you are going to see radical divergences in terms of how presidents will think about the appropriate thing for grand strategy. So let's look back in the past, and we can tell it's the past because it's in black and white and stuff. During the Cold War, particularly in the immediate aftermath of World War II, there was a genuine and vigorous US debate over what the appropriate grand strategy should be. So George Kennan, who's the large face on the left, well, right, whatever, the large face, eventually articulates the doctrine of containment, first in the long telegram that he sends back to the US State Department, and then later in the Sources of Soviet Conduct essay published in Foreign Affairs. Now, it wasn't a given that that actually would be the grand strategy, and I'm sure Kennan would later argue that it was never implemented the way he wanted it to, but Kennan didn't like anything, so you can ignore that part. But nonetheless, when he articulated the strategy, there was pushback. Walter Lippmann, who's the gentleman on the right, published a series of columns criticizing Kennan, arguing that Kennan was actually too hawkish, and that was eventually published in a small volume called The Cold War, which is where that term came from. It wasn't that Lippmann necessarily believed that there should be accommodation with the Soviet Union, but there were questions over exactly the degree to which there should be containment. And so even though the debate was somewhat straitjacketed, there were hard limits on just how hawkish and how dovish the US should be with respect to the Soviet Union. The debates were nonetheless serious, and they were engaged in it full by the participants. And so you can argue there was sort of a rough equilibrium within foreign policy. There were various schools of thought. Walter Russell Mead's book, Special Providence, I think does a really good job of talking about this, talking about the Hamiltonian school, the Wilsonian school, the Jeffersonian school, and the Jacksonian school, and how these schools of thought would sort of wax and wane, but by and large, there was a rough equilibrium between them. And indeed, particularly during the Cold War, the sort of intellectuals who helped articulate the grand strategy of containment and also popularize it through op-eds and foreign affairs essays and what have you, knew each other, and there was a legitimate degree of trust there, to the point where some of them, when they were occasionally potentially being blackmailed by the Soviet Union, their ideological opponents would not necessarily take advantage of this. So Stuart Alsop, I think, for example, got caught in the Soviet Union potentially having honey-trapped, as it were, there, and he told this to some of his colleagues, and as a result, the attempted blackmail doesn't work in the end. Now, in the 21st century, there's been more chafing at the idea of a foreign policy establishment. Indeed, we can tell this because it's no longer called the foreign policy establishment or foreign policy community. It's called the Blob. The Blob is a name that was dubbed initially by Ben Rhodes, I want to say 5 or 6 years ago, in an interview in the New York Times Magazine. And there was some pushback on that, the belief that the Blob was essentially having too much control over foreign policy. Indeed, Patrick Porter wrote an article in International Security arguing that even with the Trump administration coming into power, the Blob was still running things, that in fact there hadn't been a sea change in foreign policy. I would argue that Porter published his article too soon in the end. He published it, I think, about a year after Trump came into power, and all of the people he pointed to as members of the Blob that were within the Trump administration, people like Gary Cohn or Jim Mattis, who was the Secretary of Defense, or H.R. McMaster, who was the National Security Advisor, were all disposed of. Instead, were replaced by people, you can argue, who were not necessarily on the same page with the Blob in terms of what they thought American foreign policy should look like. And this actually suggests that there have been more fluctuations in the national security strategy than have been in the past. And I think the first example of this was in 2017, where if you read that statement, it is clear that the national security strategy of 2017 was unique in that, much like an academic article, it trashed the previous literature. Most national security strategy documents, if you look at them before 2017, you can't necessarily tell if they're written by a Republican administration or a Democratic administration. Indeed, it's not obvious often what time they were being written, because by and large, there was a continuation of the language from the previous grand strategy document. 2017 represented a genuine break, because it's one in which the sort of generally underlying principles of liberal internationalism, again, in the quote, was suggested that it had been failed, and therefore we needed to attempt a new grand strategy. And indeed, you have also seen that even in the Biden administration has not issued a national security strategy, but they have issued an interim strategic guidance. And there are enough quotes there from that interim strategic guidance suggesting that once again, they want to pivot away from what the Trump administration was doing. So we are beginning to see more volatility in US grand strategy, in which one administration in some ways rubbishes what the previous administration did. Now, to some extent, that's a time-worn tradition in American foreign policy, sort of writ large, but not necessarily in the grand strategy documents. And the fact that we're seeing it there, I think, is interesting and telling. So what's going on? Why is this happening? So I would argue that there are a couple of trends that are emerging in the marketplace of ideas and in the power of the executive branch that essentially have made this possible in a way that wasn't before. The first is, just simply put, an erosion of trust in authority and expertise. So one of the reasons that you can argue that grand strategy documents persisted from decade to decade was not just that presidents signed on to them, but also that presidents deferred to experts in terms of their articulation. And if you take a look at any sort of time series in terms of public trust in government, doesn't matter whether you look at Pew or Gallup or the General Social Survey, they all show the same thing. That essentially public trust started to decline beginning with the Vietnam War and Watergate. They stabilized for a couple of decades. It peaked up again after 9/11, and it has nosedived ever since. If I were to extend that now, I suspect it would have dipped even more. This was perhaps best personified not by a US case, but by Brexit. My favorite clip is one in which Michael Gove, who was arguing in favor of Brexit, was being asked by someone who was interviewing him, saying, listen, the Bank of England, The Economist magazine, Goldman Sachs, the IMF, the OECD, all of these institutions basically say Brexit will not work economically, that it will be an economic disaster. And Gove's response to that was, that's great. I don't want those people on my side. People have had enough of experts. Indeed, in some ways, this is one of the sources of, or wellsprings of political populism that has emerged in both the United Kingdom and the United States. And so in this sort of world, you have the erosion of trust in authority and expertise essentially means that people who would potentially be able to criticize a nascent grand strategy or grand strategic ideas will not be listened to as much. And so in some ways, in the older days, when you had a marketplace of ideas, the barriers to entry were high. You kind of had to look like me, or you had to have my academic pedigree, or things like that. And one of the things about the new marketplace of ideas is that, to the good, is that barriers for entry have been reduced. It is much easier for anyone to now participate in this marketplace of ideas. The bad news is that the barriers to exit have gone up. And by that I mean dumb ideas don't die in this new marketplace of ideas. They just persist because they can't be discredited. We also see this in the form of political polarization. The second trend in some way on this point is the growth of political polarization. And we can see this most obviously in terms of voting within Congress. The short version of this is that Democrats have moved somewhat to the left over the last 50 years. Republicans have moved way, way, way to the right. But you have seen, some of this can be attributed to what is called ideological sorting, namely the end of Rockefeller Republicans in New England and the end of sort of white Southern Democrats in the South. But it's not only that. It is also that you are seeing people become more genuinely ideologically divided. So the country is growing more politically polarized. And this is a problem because the more polarized the climate, the tougher it is for people to rely on experts. So the political science on polarization is pretty clear, which is that Alexander Gusinger and Elizabeth Saunders have written a great article, the International Securities Quarterly, basically concluding that once an issue gets politically polarized, the influence of experts disappears. So in other words, they conducted survey experiments where they asked people, what do you think about this issue? What do you think about that issue? Informing them about whether there was an expert consensus on it or not. And when it was an issue that generally was believed to have high political valence, the expert consensus had no effect. If, on the other hand, it was an issue on which the public wasn't necessarily concerned about or wasn't a high-profile political issue, then the expert consensus did have an effect. But the problem is that every issue is now becoming polarized. And so as a result, there is no independent effect of experts necessarily, which means they can't necessarily tell you whether a grand strategy is a good or a bad idea. We also see this in Ken Schultz's work, who argues that essentially one of the things that polarization prevents is policy learning. In other words, traditionally, if a policy has failed, ideally there is some sort of reckoning for why it was considered to fail. But in a world of political polarization, the party that promoted the policy will simply deny that it failed. So in fact, for example, the Trump administration's response to the pandemic was a smashing success. Or the Biden administration's response to global supply chain issues is, it'll all sort out and we don't need to worry about it. But if you have a situation in which neither side will acknowledge any sort of error, then learning is extremely difficult. And we can tell from voting patterns in the US Senate that increasingly this belief that foreign policy stops at the water's edge, that there is no partisanship in terms of foreign policy, does not show up in either Senate or House votes. That indeed those issues are now just as polarized in Congress as domestic policy issues. And indeed, perhaps the best way you can sort of define what we mean by polarization is how you interpret this picture. So I remember when this picture came out, it was at the G7, I believe in Montreal or Quebec, I can't remember, it was in Canada. And I believe it was in 2018. It was the last time during the Trump administration that they all got together. At the time that photo came out, Democrats looked at it and saw, see, Trump's standing, he's isolated, the US is isolated, this is a disaster, this is supposed to be our closest allies, this isn't working out. Trump supporters, and I remember seeing this on social media, looked at this photo and said, look at how tough Trump is. He's surrounded by all these people who disagree with him. He's sticking to his guns. He's fighting. He's actually putting America first. He's not, kowtowing to allies. Okay, both those interpretations are actually potentially valid. I'm not saying one is wrong or one is right. The point is, if they can't agree on the facts, then there's no way you're going to have any agreement on interpretations of the facts. The third issue is the erosion of checks and balances. Which is to say that in order for grand strategy to have any sort of enduring, credible commitment, you need to have congressional buy-in. You need to have both parties potentially signing on to this. But for this to happen, Congress has to actually be invested in foreign policy. The president can't just have sole authority. Now, there is an ongoing debate within presidential studies about just how much power a president has. And this is perhaps epitomized by Richard Neustadt, who wrote Presidential Power, arguing that the presidency was a fundamentally weak political institution, that in fact the only way a president could be powerful was to be persuasive. That was counteracted, the sort of opposing viewpoint came out a decade later with Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who argued that in fact the president was amassing ever more amounts of power. And he was writing this during the Nixon administration. Now, suddenly when Nixon resigned due to Watergate, and then there were post-Watergate reforms, it was thought, oh, Neustadt turned out to be true. Yeah, well, Neustadt was wrong. Basically, that's what I'm suggesting, that in the end, Schlesinger proved to be correct, at least right now. And indeed, particularly post 9/11, you have seen presidents enact more and more power. And indeed, the growing polarization of political parties has actually made that easier. In other words, when Congress is deadlocked, that gives the president carte blanche to exercise even greater power. And we saw this during the Trump administration, because even though Donald Trump was a fundamentally weak human being, he was occupying an incredibly powerful office. And therefore, even when he failed to get what he wanted from Congress, like let's say emergency, funding to build the wall along the southern border, he could then just declare a state of emergency and reallocate the funds himself. Congress tried to block this, but basically, so long as the presidential party has more than a third of the seats in the Senate, they will always be able to withstand attempts to override a veto, and therefore the president will often be able to get what they want regardless. And indeed, at the same time, legislatures, and my understanding is I'm citing a local Dartmouth professor here by doing this. Yes, okay, this is good. I want to make that clear. I did not actually know she was here when I did this. So this is not just sucking up to Dartmouth. I genuinely think this is a great book. That Linda Fowler has pointed out that Congress has displayed less and less and less interest in foreign policy. And part of this, to be fair, is because the public is not terribly enthused about foreign policy for a variety of reasons. And so as a result, Congress is displaying less of a watchdog authority, less oversight. And by the way, because they do this, this actually affords intellectuals like myself or Professor Woolforth or others the ability to weigh in at key moments about grand strategy. In other words, congressional hearings are one of the ways in which presumably intellectuals can actually try to have their voice heard by people in power. If that ceases to be a sort of transmission belt mechanism, then again, the marketplace of ideas is not working terribly well. So, the formula for no grand strategy, or for no effective grand strategy. You have a powerful president. You have a powerful president in a polarized society in which there is disregard for experts. In this world, the president obviously can control foreign policy, and the president can potentially articulate their own grand strategy, but that grand strategy will not live beyond that president. Because essentially the next person who comes into power will potentially exercise more power, or more influence. And we can see this, by the way, in terms of the Biden administration. When Biden gave his first joint address to Congress, technically not the State of the Union, but essentially the State of the Union, he acknowledged in his State of the Union that on the one hand, America was back and that he had executed a foreign policy that he believed to be fundamentally at odds with Donald Trump, and nonetheless said that foreign leaders are basically asking him, how do we know that what you're saying will actually persist? How do we know that what you're saying is US foreign policy will endure past your administration? And in some ways, that's the bigger problem. For grand strategies to matter, they have to be heard. The signal has to be credible. And if you are a foreign power and think, well, what you say might hold for the next couple of years, but not beyond that, then essentially the ability to articulate grand strategy becomes enervated. So can this be reversed? Okay. Again, grand strategies by the US mattered in the past. I'm not saying that they've never been influential. I'm just saying they can't work right now. There are ways in which you can argue that the American public might not be as polarized as you think about certain things. So if you ask, the American public how they feel about immigration, they're pretty supportive of immigration, actually. And indeed, despite all of the claims about Donald Trump sort of tapping into some sort of popular wellspring against immigration, actually, immigration is much more popular now than it was even when, back in 2004. And actually, the 90s were the low point on this. So maybe the public is changing its mind. Similarly, if you want to talk about, let's say, international trade, and again, I do care about international political economy, so this is why I focus on these things. Again, there was a dip during the 2008 financial crisis, or right before the 2008 financial crisis, but enthusiasm for trade has actually gone up. And indeed, it went up during the Trump years. It hasn't gone down during the Biden year. Indeed, working through the United Nations, again, pretty popular. I'm on the board of advisors for the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. The American public is pretty persistently liberal internationalist when you ask them these questions. This suggests there is a solid foundation for a grand strategy premised on these kinds of values that would presumably endure and would presumably be popular. But, and you knew there was a but, it doesn't matter. And here's why it doesn't matter. The public fundamentally does not care about foreign policy. Not only that, they shouldn't. And by that, I mean the public is rationally ignorant. This is a concept in public opinion research. And to be clear, rational ignorance does not mean the public is stupid or dumb. It means the public is uninformed about foreign policy. And the reason they are uninformed is that they don't think that foreign policy connects to their lives. Now, you can see people like Joe Biden and Donald Trump trying to reverse this. When Joe Biden talks about a foreign policy for the middle class, he is recognizing that he somehow has to make a connection between foreign policy and what people think are pocketbook issues. The problem is that, again, the public doesn't necessarily believe it, so they won't necessarily be invested in foreign policy, which means, yeah, the majority of the public probably prefers free trade. The majority of the public is perfectly copacetic on immigration and working through multilateral institutions. Are they going to vote based on these things? No, and that is what politicians care about. And indeed, if you start introducing abstract ideas like the liberal international order, and again, grand strategy is in some ways about abstract ideas, the public tunes out. The Center for American Progress did a focus group on this and discovered that basically if you tried to do this, the public had no idea what you were talking about. Now, maybe you can try to sell this in language that is more accessible, but again, this requires investing significant amount of resources. And in the past, when politicians have tried to do this, Woodrow Wilson in 1918, Henry Kissinger in the 1970s, even George W. Bush in the wake of the War on Terror, it hasn't necessarily worked. The public hasn't necessarily been terribly engaged. The result is that we are increasingly facing a situation in which presidents are emerging not necessarily from the moderate elements of their party, but from the more ideologically, extreme is not quite the right word I want to use, but ideological poles of the party. So at the time that he was president, George W. Bush was thought to be the most conservative Republican ever elected into office. He was replaced by Barack Obama, who at the time was thought to be the most liberal Democrat ever elected to office. And then he was replaced by Donald Trump, who again was thought to be the most conservative, Republican, at least based on how he governed, ever elected. What happens if we extrapolate this forward? Sure, we have Joe Biden now. Joe Biden essentially campaigned, as someone who was supposed to be a moderate, although how he's governed is another interesting question altogether. And he does seem like he's catering to some extent to his progressives. What if Joe Biden is replaced by Tom Cotton, who is then replaced by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? we are going to continue to have gyrating foreign policies because there is not going to be a lot that holds those three together in terms of the way they view the world. And so as a result, you're going to have foreign policy whipsawing between left and right. So essentially, the problem in American grand strategy, there's something called the Mexico City policy, which some of you might be aware of in terms of American politics. The Mexico City policy is a policy that determines whether or not the federal government will aid or will provide aid to family agencies internationally that help with family planning, whether or not they fund abortions or not. So when Ronald Reagan was inaugurated in 1981, on Inauguration Day, he signed something banning the US government from funding agencies that helped fund abortions as a source of their family planning. Since then, there is a tradition within the US government. Whenever a Democrat is elected, on January 20th, they sign something reversing the Mexico City policy. When a Republican is elected president, on January 20th, they institute the Mexico City policy. I want to suggest that essentially the problem with foreign policy going forward is that it is going to become the Mexico City policy writ large. You will increasingly see a number of executive orders signed on January 20th or the first week, essentially making U-turns on foreign policy. And the problem is that for any kind of grand strategy to be enduring, you can't engage in those constant U-turns. And so to conclude, I don't think grand strategy will have a half-life in the United States so long as the underlying political conditions continue as they are. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dan, do you want to take a seat with me here and we can take questions? Sure. And I would like to remind those, or not remind those, but tell people, inform people who happen to be watching this online that we are welcoming questions from you. All you need to do is email global.security@dartmouth.edu and we can field your questions. But for now, I want to bring questions into the room. But first, I will take a tradition of asking the first question, always a friendly question, a question that is to make our guests feel comfortable. That is, we're not challenging the guest, we're not pushing back on the guest at all. So my question to you, Dan, is like, how can you think this when it's so obviously incorrect? And that is, like, if you think about it, if you look at the United States in 1950, 1975, 2000, and 2020, all the following things were true. It had alliances in Europe, alliances in Asia, meant to deter rivals, meant to reassure allies. It had a policy of trying to stop nuclear proliferation. It had a policy ongoing and steady of trying to encourage overall a flourishing global economy. It stood in favor of a basic core international institutions. It had an array of treaties that it was a party to. And isn't it the case that all of these things are still true today? Sure, we can find individual presidents like Donald Trump who said bad things about these things. He didn't like NATO. He announced an intention to pull out of the Paris Treaty. He didn't like the specific deal we had with Iran. But in terms of those core commitments, which after all, isn't that what grand strategy is about? Long-standing core commitments. He really did not change any of them.
No, I'm going to push back on that. How do I put this? Bill, you ignorant slut. No.
That's a generational reference.
That is a generational reference. So, first of all, I think you do need to distinguish. I guess the way I would put it is following. First, there's a difference between stock and, in some ways, you're making a stock versus flow difference, which is you can argue that the stock of foreign policy assets has persisted somewhat. So, like the alliances, yes, they're still there. The U.S. membership in multilateral institutions, yes, by and large, still there. But grand strategy is not just about that. It's also about the future. It's about articulating what's going to matter going forward. And on that, yeah, I do think there were significant changes. And I do think the Trump administration really did actually, they didn't do it competently, but did they actually affect change? Yes, I think they did. There is no way you can argue that U.S. approach toward China stayed constant between the Obama administration and then the Trump administration. I don't think you can argue that the U.S. approach toward multilateral institutions stayed constant. I don't think you can say that the U.S. approach to international trade or the global economy stayed constant, or the U.S. approach to climate change. These are not small issues. And in terms of the alliances, yes, the U.S. stays within NATO. and the US doesn't withdraw from other treaties. On the other hand, did Trump want to do those things, and did we come close to doing those things? That's a separate question. And in some ways, this raises the question of just how durable those commitments are. In some ways, you can argue that the Trump years were an interesting stress test for what endured and to what degree did other arrangements wind up, proving to be more fragile. So I think a lot of people, and I will say myself included, didn't think the US was going to walk away from the Iran deal in 2017 because Trump got elected. Because again, if you do that, it has issues on reputation. As it turns out, we did. And this gets to a separate issue, which is things like NATO are tougher to withdraw because they are treaties. Although one of the things we now realize is that a lot of these treaties have withdrawal clauses that are far easier for presidents to exercise than I think we had previously anticipated. The more important thing is that it's now going to be increasingly difficult for the US to sign new treaties. When was the last time the US ratified a treaty? And so going forward, part of the problem is that the existing stock of global governance structures isn't perfectly well suited towards tomorrow's challenges. If the US wants to create a new grand strategy, presumably it would want to create new structures, but it can't create new structures bound by law at this point. What it's doing instead are executive agreements. So think about the steel and aluminum deal that the US just signed with the European Union, which admittedly still has to be negotiated. My question is, does that last past the Biden administration? The Obama administration, towards the second half of its term, began to recognize that it couldn't get things through Congress. So it does Paris through executive agreement. It does the Iran nuclear deal through executive agreement. It opens Cuba through executive agreement. Trump was able to reverse all these things and was fully within his rights to do so because he was the president. And so my point is that without congressional buy-in, because Congress is so polarized and because they're checked out, you can't get those credible commitments. So going forward, sure, presidents can do things, and then that'll be reversed by the next president.
Wow. Well, on that optimistic note, I do want to encourage people from the audience to pose questions if they would like, and we have roving microphones for anybody who wishes to do so. Please don't be shy. I see people, there we go, in the back. We'll start things off.
Am I allowed to remove the...
Well, we figure we're more than 6 feet away.
Yeah, I'm socially distancing from all of you.
Yeah.
All right, well, I was in the Foreign Service for 25 years, and in the heyday of...
Oh, crap. Okay, go ahead. No, because you actually know something is what I'm saying. Keep going.
Anyway, I'll get to my point, and which is one could argue that the George W. Bush administration, with its actions in the Mideast and Iraq, is probably made the biggest foreign policy blunder in American history. And I know you've read that in various places.
I've heard it once or twice.
And
yes.
Then, of course, in that same administration, you had the housing crisis and the financial meltdown, which exacerbated the inequalities in America. And both of these things, I would argue, really, you could say, was the source of a lot of the disarray that you've outlined in your talk. It was kind of a break point for me anyway. And then on top of this, and this, I'm not an expert, but social media and Facebook was an overlay that arrived around the year 2000 and afterwards. My point would be, would you be willing to entertain that these were items that had particular impact, and that it's not too far-fetched to think, and America is brushed up against this type of thing throughout its history, but we've always come back and surmounted. A lot of people have argued this, like Henry Grunwald and others, that no matter how close we got to significant unraveling, America up till now has always restabilized. And I would just toss that out to get your reaction, whether we're in suffered in kind of unique circumstances, and that we shouldn't just give up and go into the gloom and doom or LOL or whatever you had there.
Oh, it's over there. Okay.
It's been taken down.
It's been taken down to there, yeah. Although I do have to admit, like, it's a fitting thing. So really, you're asking two questions. The first one is, you know, are these other things that I talked about, you know, are the things that you mentioned, the Iraq invasion, 2008 financial crisis, aren't those, you know, underlying factors as well? And then also, you know, surely we can pull ourselves back from the precipice. On the first point, those certainly did not help, but I would actually argue that some of the trends that I talk about precede those things. Political polarization started well before 9/11 and well before the 2008 financial crisis. Even before that, I mean, actually, if you take a look at voting, it really began, I mean, in some ways, the late 60s is when it starts, and it sort of continues on from there. Similarly, the rise in income inequality that you're talking about, or wealth inequality, 2008 concentrates it, well, not 2008, but really 2010, concentrates it, but again, that was something that emerges in the late 70s as well. You know, the erosion, and similarly, the erosion of trust and authority and expertise. Yes, it takes the last nosedive during the 2000s, but that was something that, again, the 1960s, you know, with Vietnam and Watergate really starts the fall in some ways. So it's not that I necessarily disagree with you, but I think what you're describing are more the coup de grace of how we got to today rather than the sort of underlying causes, which is to say these were sort of decade-long trends that Iraq and 2008 exacerbated, but they were already there in some ways. Now, as to your question of whether, you know, we can pull back from the precipice, I want you to be correct, and I hope that you are. And the only thing I will add on this point is that the last time the country was in a situation like this, in which you had these three trends all at once, erosion of trust and authority and expertise, you know, political polarization in particular, and income inequality, was essentially the first decade of the 1900s. And then the result of that was the progressive movement, and then eventually the emergence of a sort of foreign policy establishment. The one caveat I will give to that is for you to get from there to the period where you actually had more of a national consensus, you had to have 2 world wars and a Great Depression. And if we have had, frankly, shocks that have been almost as severe, if you take a look at 2008, if you take a look at COVID, and I'm not convinced that there's any more consensus now than there was before. Now, maybe this will change going forward. I'm not a fortune teller in that way. So it is entirely possible. But I confess I'm not optimistic.
Well, if that's the case, we're in for serious trouble. And I ain't going to be around if these youngsters are.
Well, I don't know if I'd refer to them as youngsters, but our students in the room are strongly encouraged to pose questions if you got them. Is that a hand? Yep.
We can hear me. My classmate and I were discussing like the precipice of polarization just yesterday, and I agree with the shocks to COVID that we need something bigger. We need something huge, and I don't think we'll get that.
And I mean, this is a scary thing to say. What, you need something bigger than COVID? I mean, COVID, forget your lifetime, in my lifetime, COVID was easily the thing that had the largest impact on my daily life. It had the largest impact on all of our daily lives. You're wearing masks. Thank God I'm having water, otherwise I would have to wear a mask. Your change in daily life, bigger than anything since World War II. So I don't know how you get bigger than that is what worries me.
Or that it's impossible. My question was to trace back a bit regarding your statement on rational ignorance,
yeah.
I think you said, which I agree with very strongly, that there's certain economic ideals or political ideals that voters have, and the administration is expected to uphold those. Yet with administrations like Trump's, we see a lot of broad, I would say you characterized it as having some pretty broad changes in foreign policy over its course that I'm not sure align with what people were expecting what voters were expecting going in. And so in that case, like, do those big moves deserve attention from the public? Or is that something that can be handled internally within the government?
So a few things on this. The first is that I wrote an entire book about him. So Donald Trump is clearly an outlier along a wide array of dimensions. There is one area, however, in which he is consistent with prior presidents, which is Donald Trump legitimately wanted to keep his promises in terms of the campaign. And if you read what he said during the campaign, in some ways he really did try to follow through on those things. You know, he really did think the liberal international order had stacked the deck against the United States. He thought that trade deals were unfair to the United States. He thought that our allies were somehow free riding off of us in terms of defense spending and so on and so forth. He wanted to build a wall along the southern border. He said he was going to do all these things during the campaign. So it shouldn't have surprised anyone that when he got into office, he actually did try to do these things. Now, he didn't necessarily succeed in all of these things because, as it turns out, Donald Trump was not the most well-organized of presidents, perhaps would be the way to put it. But on your question about whether or not the public, didn't like this, and as a result, I mean, are you asking, did the public, should the Trump administration have realized the public wouldn't like this, or that because the public didn't like this, he suffered?
That I think I might have misinterpreted your argument, that the public shouldn't need to worry about foreign policy once the administration is in place. Trump didn't follow through on some of those promises,
right.
And should the public be aware of that?
Yes, but I mean, I think the other way to put it is the reason I say that the public will not pay attention to this stuff is the public normally is not going to pay attention to stuff unless it affects their day-to-day lives. And to some extent, very few of the foreign policy decisions that Trump made affected people's day-to-day lives. Maybe the putting kids in cages thing did, because literally they saw these images on television and they didn't want to see those things. But beyond that, these were sort of abstract stories to most people that didn't necessarily get a lot of press attention because the press also wants to cover things that affects people's daily lives. And so exiting the Iran deal, yes, that's high-stake geopolitics, but it didn't necessarily generate much in the way of news. And so as a result, this winds up being an instance in which, again, the public didn't like most of what Trump did on foreign policy. They like having alliances. They like, as I said, they're enthusiastic about free trade. But the public wasn't necessarily aware of it either. They didn't necessarily pay that much attention to it. And that's the issue. I'm not saying, my point is not whether the public should or should not. I'm saying that rational ignorance means the public will not, to be clear.
Yes, in the back, please.
Hi, my question is regarding the U.S. stance on China. But in what way do you think that the Biden administration's approach on China has differed from Trump's? Because you're making the argument that it's essentially a U-turn with each new administration.
Yeah.
But I've seen a lot of commentary, and it seems believable to me that much of the strategy has remained consistent. If you could comment on one aspect of the U.S. stance towards China that I'm particularly interested in, which is the AI arms race and the need for the United States to maintain technological superiority in the decades ahead. Could you comment on, you talk about Tom Cotton and AOC as potential future presidents. If you would speculate a bit on what those presidential administrations, what kinds of stances might they have on a topic like the tech race with China and the kinds of pendulum shifts that we could see in the future? Thank you.
That is a great question because it also brings up, I think, in some ways, the better, this is actually a falsifying data point because I agree with you. By and large, the Biden approach to China is pretty similar to what Trump did. I do think there are a couple of differences, however, that demonstrate, again, that this is a different administration. The two that are important are, first, the Biden administration clearly wants to cooperate with China on climate change, which is something the Trump administration just didn't care about. It was just not an element of their grand strategy. So that's something new. I think the bigger and this really is a difference in terms of grand strategy, is that the Trump administration believed that essentially it was engaging in a great power competition with China, and to do that, it had to go alone. Whereas the Biden administration policy on China, I think, is very clearly that it does want to deal with a rising China in a similar way, but to do so with allies. And so that's why you've seen a differing approach between the Biden administration and the European Union. That's why you've seen a bolstering of the Quad, which was something the Trump administration was mildly interested in, but didn't really take advantage of. And so the fundamental difference between, I think, Biden and Trump is that Biden believes that if you're going to confront China, you do it with America's friends. Whereas Trump, I think, believed America has no friends. We have to confront them alone. And that is a pretty significant difference, to be fair. And that's a difference in terms of grand strategy. Because you can argue that where Biden and Trump agreed was on the ends, which was to say we need to have an approach toward China that preserves our way of life and preserves our interests. The difference was in terms of the means, which is that the Trump administration believed in the power of economic coercion, believed in the power of sort of bellicose diplomacy and what have you. The Biden administration has some faith in economic coercion that's, I think, misplaced, but also it believes that it can do this through a multilateral framework. And that is a difference in terms of the means. And so that's where I think there's a difference. I'm going to completely duck your question on Senator Cotton and Congressman Ocasio-Cortez on AI and tech, because I don't know either of them well enough, and I don't want to put words in their mouth.
So I have an interesting question I'll just throw out there while people think of other ones, which is, well, this is a question interesting to me. So folks, the person sitting next to me here is not only a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School, but he's also a contributing editor at Washington Post. He's an active social media presence with very, very large following. He is a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution.
No, sorry, that's not true.
Oh, that's not true.
No, I'm no
I'm
longer.
just reading that off your Washington Post page.
I got to change that. That ended on September 1st. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, so go with that.
So the point is, you are doing a lot that would indicate the activities of a person who's seeking to influence the public conversation about foreign policy. And I guess the question would be, somewhat provocatively, why do you do this?
First of all, oh God. So let me give the answer that's consistent with my talk, which is, I think what you're trying to say is, if I think grand strategy is meaningless, why am I, engaging in these sorts of debates?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to give two answers. One is that you don't think grand strategy is meaningless. The other could be that you think that there are American policies that aren't as grand strategy, that might still be part of a public debate.
No, and the answer is the second one, which is, just because grand strategy is dead doesn't mean that U.S. foreign policy, stops, or that public, intellectuals or experts can't influence, some aspects of foreign policy. You just have to pick your battles a little more carefully. And so, yeah, I still, and part of this is fighting the good fight. I mean, just because I think that it's a bad climate for people like you or I to try to influence the marketplace of ideas doesn't mean I therefore, take my keyboard and go home. I'm still going to rage against the machine. I'm still going to, write things that suggest that the way we're doing one particular, policy is wrong. And I have to say, I do consider myself fortunate that occasionally these things actually have an impact. So, I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs this fall called "The United States of Sanctions," saying that we're sanctioning too much at this point, that we've become hooked on this policy tool because we've neglected other policy tools. And I've been pleasantly surprised at the reception that has received. I wasn't necessarily sure that, if you publish a piece in Foreign Affairs in the woods, does anyone hear it?
Right.
And sometimes people still do. And so, just because I'm saying that grand strategy is next to impossible for the United States does not mean that it is impossible for people to influence particular foreign policy ideas. But I think you have to be more small bore now, in a way that was not necessarily true, 30 or 40 years ago. And part of this also, I don't know if this is good or bad, it's just different. And that's primarily what I'm trying to say.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. It's a super interesting conversation. I also spent time in Washington, and I've served in government, so I've had to read national security strategies to help implement them. So maybe an observation and a question. They're not on everybody's desk. I think it is often used as a reference material to understand, since there's so many career people in government, which way we should generally head. Mm-hmm. And if you see, perhaps one way national security strategy has been used is course correction, right? So you look at the Clinton administration in the 90s, recovering from all the wars that broke out, peacekeeping collapses, and they redefine a bit how to engage in those civil conflicts, where you see after 9/11 an emphasis on counterterrorism, or after the intervention in Iraq, a whole field on post-conflict stabilization. So it's also speaking back to a community of actors. You can imagine today climate and the pandemic being highlighted by the Biden administration. So the question might be is maybe in your half-life of grand strategies, we're in a moment where we don't know what's next. And if you believe the public isn't voting based on foreign policy, does this give room to the next whatever, we're not in containment anymore, to have those ideas sorted out almost in a free way between the political actors? Is it actually a potential bright spot that since they're not voted into office on foreign policy, there could actually be built a new consensus about where the U.S. heads?
In theory, yes. In practice, no. In theory, you're absolutely right. As you say, if the public doesn't care that much about foreign policy, and indeed, that's why foreign policy for the longest time has been generally viewed as an elite-driven phenomenon. Our colleague at Georgetown, Elizabeth Saunders, I think, is working on a book on this that I desperately want her to finish so I can read it on this very topic. In practice, however, my skepticism is on the idea that if Biden administration people manage to articulate this, that a Cotton administration would look at this and think, oh, you know what, there's some pretty good ideas here. We should continue this. I don't think that's how politics works anymore. I think the partisan divisions are sufficiently large that even if the other side comes up with a good idea, it's not necessarily going to be adhered to. The other thing is that I'm not sure that the ideas will necessarily be all that good if either side, frankly, doesn't listen or doesn't care what experts say. And the problem is that we're increasingly in an environment where that's the case. The Trump administration gloried in the fact that what they were suggesting in terms of grand strategy was opposed by large elements of the foreign policy establishment. Biden administration, on the one hand sort of talks about the idea that we're, America's back and so on and so forth, but there are issues like on foreign economic policy where they exult in the fact that the establishment doesn't like what they're doing either. And so populism is not just on the right, I guess is my point. And so I think, again, what you're saying could happen. I just don't think it will.
Other questions, pushback, commentary, thoughts to get off your chest? Yes, Professor Valentino.
So thanks, Dan, for the very provocative talk. I guess I have a question that kind of follows on what Tori
You were going to say screed before.
This is a follow-on in some ways to what Tori just asked, and it's kind of the, what's better than, grand strategy? What do we have if not grand strategy? And, you kind of implied that we should do this kind of piecemeal, more dynamic thing. But one of the things I always thought, maybe even the most important thing I thought that grand strategy did wasn't to communicate to the public or to Congress, but it was to discipline the executive branch and essentially to help the executive branch understand what's in and what's out, help the executive branch say no when the State Department wants to do what the State Department wants to do and the Defense Department wants to do what the Defense Department wants to do. Mm-hmm. There is some arbiter for that. Instead of the world where when nothing is down on paper, when there's no clear overarching policy, everybody just gets to argue for what they want. So the Defense Department gets to say, we foresee a world in which we need a lot more tanks and planes and bombs. And Homeland Security gets to say, we foresee a world in which there's a lot more terrorism And so we need to build up a whole bunch of different counterterrorism centers around the world. And the State Department says, we foresee a world in which diplomacy is more important than ever, and so please put more energy and money into foreign diplomacy and USAID and all those things. And there's no way to say no if there's not some overarching policy that describes what our goals are and how each of those pieces fits into it. Doesn't matter in some sense what the public thinks about that. That's a inside the administration game. And in my view, that's certainly one of the main things that a grand strategy is supposed to do. Now, yeah, maybe that's going to change every time there's an administration, and maybe that's a bigger change than it used to be. But those administrations, it seems to me, would still benefit from having some way to communicate to the many parts of their bureaucracy what it is that the United States is supposed to do and not supposed to do. And I don't know that I'm hearing a better way than the same kind of thing we've been trying all along. So maybe just a more pointed way of asking the same question Tori put at you.
So that's a great question. I would say 2 points in response. Well, 3 points, I guess. The first is that I think what matters just as much in terms of is not just the executive branch, but also presumably you're trying to send a signal to international actors. And so that's the part where I do think, even if you're talking about it working within the executive branch, if it only lasts for 4 years, then it's not going to be a terribly successful grand strategy in terms of advancing U.S. interests elsewhere. So that's an important point. But let's take what you're saying as given. I think that's a fair counter-argument to say, well, even if they only last for the duration of administration, if it's well articulated, there's still utility in that. And I think that might be true, but I would offer one caveat to this, which is, and this is partly the sort of trends that I'm talking about in terms of polarization. That works so long as the foreign policy agencies believe the grand strategy actually matters and believe that the president is aware of the grand strategy and will actually implement it. And this is, again, an interesting distinction between Biden and Trump, I would add. But not, this is where Trump actually has more commonality with Obama and George W. Bush. So Elizabeth Saunders, again, I really like talking about her work, wrote a great piece in I.O. a couple of years ago comparing and contrasting the same people under George H.W. Bush versus George W. Bush. And one of the things she found is that when you have presidents who don't know much about foreign policy, it doesn't matter what the grand strategy is because the cabinet heads, will do what they do, and they can essentially tell the president or work around the president. Since the president doesn't know enough about foreign affairs, they both have the incentive and the ability to neglect whatever is put on paper. And this is where Biden actually does represent a genuine break. Biden is really the most experienced foreign policy president since George H.W. Bush. And so this might actually be an arena where if there's a strategy document that's eventually articulated beyond the interim guidance, that might have an effect. But I'm also wary that Biden is the exception and not the rule on this going forward. Generally speaking, in the post-Cold War period, we've elected presidents who are foreign policy neophytes. And so as a result, even the thing you're talking about, I'm not sure would actually work.
Was there a question over here? Yes, please.
So basically, I was wondering, even though America's, I guess, hard power seems to have relatively declined, I was wondering about, basically their soft power, which seems to at least, I guess the prevalence of American ideals, especially among the Western world, seem to be holding on quite strong. And I wanted to ask, how do you think this will affect grand strategy, or I guess maybe lack thereof in the future?
I think there are two answers I have to that. The first is that I think this is one of those things that is genuinely going to fluctuate between administrations. Because generally speaking, the idea of promoting American values and the idea of promoting democracy, that's pretty popular with Democrats. That was not something that the Trump administration cared about all that much, unless it was a government that it really didn't like. And it'll be interesting to see whether that endures for the next, successive GOP administrations. I think that's a genuine. I don't know the answer to that. But let's put it this way: if Trump gets reelected in 2024, or Trump at least has veto power over who does get, the nomination and potentially the election, then I kind of wonder if that will be a bipartisan thing. The second thing is, and I haven't read this, but I think a Pew report just came out yesterday on attitudes about U.S. democracy. And one of the disconcerting things here is that while the values that the U.S. promotes in terms of democracy are generally, embraced by the West. In fact, embraced beyond the West, I would say. The problem here is that there is such a thing as leading by example, and right now the U.S. is setting a piss-poor example for everyone else. And so this is a thing where, events like January the 6th, events like, constantly having these negotiations over the debt ceiling, this is not the best way to run the railroad. And so while there might be belief in democracy, I'm not sure there's going to be all that much confidence in American democracy. And that, I think, is eventually going to dent America's soft power.
Yes, please.
Thank you for coming in today. I understand that you think the influence of intellectual opinions is declining, or that's what you said in the presentation. Yes. But since grand strategy is not dead yet, and the debates are still ongoing, or like the future of grand strategy debates are still ongoing, is there a school of thought that you would align with in terms of like deep engagement or restraint or offshore balancing or any of those? Because it's not dead yet. So if you had to choose one, would you, or would you just scrap it all together?
I'm just going to protest that you're saying not dead yet with a British accent, because it's too on the mark in terms of Monty Python. So like, it's just, I'm just going to surrender to this point. I mean, I guess, I think, does Bob Hart have selective engagement? Was that his term?
Yes.
I guess I'll go with selective engagement. I'm not a huge fan of deep engagement at this point, no offense. But, and I, in the sense of, I think you can argue the US overcommitted to the Middle East, and there was a misallocation of resources there. And in that sense, you can see the elements of what a grand strategy looks like with Biden, which is the idea of we're going to de-emphasize certain regions because we need to focus on other regions. So in that sense, that's something I genuinely approve of. And this is an interesting possibility where you might have consensus across what you would call grand strategic schools of thought. So the idea being, for example, in terms of dealing with China, one of the things that I think is fascinating is that realists who have long decried US adventurism in the Middle East, suddenly on China are talking very similar to the deep engagement folks. And this might be the one area, one of the things I didn't say about what could, cause form a new consensus is that in theory, if there is an overarching threat that everyone agrees on, much like the Soviet Union during the Cold War, in theory, that could create a sort of new foreign policy consensus. Now, there is an article that came out, however, that suggests that historically and in terms of public opinion polls, that doesn't actually hold up. And I remember putting that in one of the articles, and I apologize profusely to the author because I can't remember her name right now. But I guess my point is that I hope that's true. I, again, am skeptical that it actually is. And also, again, the British accent was totally unfair.
Any questions? Perhaps I could put forth a question, not to say that we're closing, perhaps to bring our proceedings to conclusion, which is, you talked in your entire talk almost entirely about the United States. Yeah. You made one reference to Britain and Michael Gove's comment about them, and a brief reference to populism. Is this a US-specific phenomenon? I know you're mainly focused on the US, and the US obviously is a pretty doggone important actor, but is this a US-only phenomenon? Is it a democracy-only phenomenon? And if that's the case, if either one of those two is true, is it also, do you see authoritarians still having grand strategies, and does it matter? Are we at some disadvantage if either the US or democracies writ large are in your world of not being able to have a grand strategy, and there are other types of countries that do have grand strategies? So, I mean, what's the competitive implications of the stuff that you presented to us today?
So I do think that this is a democracy-wide phenomenon. I don't think it's unique to the United States. I think the United States has certain particular disadvantages that mean it's more acute here. But, to some extent, we've seen this in the UK. We've seen this in continental Europe. You see it in Korea, South Korea. You see it in Japan to some extent. So I don't think this is unique to the United States. Do I think that therefore authoritarian states have an advantage now because they have, can articulate grand strategies in a different way? Not necessarily. Authoritarian states have their own problems when it comes to grand strategy, which is, again, remember I said that there was a democratic advantage in theory because of the marketplace of ideas and because of credible commitment. The problem that authoritarian states have is that they can't credibly commit either. And their marketplace of ideas, would be safe to say, is somewhat stilted. So the notion that, that states like China or Russia or Saudi Arabia, will be able to pursue far-reaching, well thought out grand strategies is, I think, just as much a myth. What I do think is not so much that they have an advantage, but I think that perhaps the playing field has been leveled more than what we would have thought. If we were having this conversation 30 years ago, I'd be talking about the democratic advantage more. And I think what we're learning is, at least in the short term, I don't know if this is permanent, but at least in the short term, we have to question the premises upon the notion of this democratic advantage in terms of conducting foreign policy.
Well, thank you, Dan. I prefer to sort of have a glass half full way of concluding here, in that that the authoritarians also are lame at grand strategy, at least. And on that optimistic note, allow me to thank you, and please join me in thanking Professor Daniel Dresner for coming today. It was a wonderful, illuminating conversation.
Thank you very much.